Good afternoon and welcome to What Makes Art a Public Good. We are here to consider the role of arts and culture in the U.S. in a very contradictory moment. Colleges and universities are cutting liberal arts courses, but DIY creativity has never been greater, not just on social media, but the arts and crafts industry is now a $30 billion concern and predicted to grow by 5% over the next 5 years. There are ongoing fights about public funding, but cities are increasingly hoping that tourism rebounds, the heart of which is culture, as a way of climbing out of the pandemic. And the conversation about work-life balance continues, just as new science is showing objective benefits of cultural participation. So, what makes art a public good or not? Public good, something with broad benefits, including social cohesion. Public good as a commodity whose value can be priced. We have an extraordinary panel of folks to help us think about this. Melody Barnes, distinguished career in public service, including as domestic policy advisor to President Obama and now executive director of the Aspen Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia. Chris Bedford, who has had many leadership roles in the visual arts. He's currently the Helen and Charles Schwab Director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, having come to that role a year ago from the Baltimore Museum of Art. And Damian Woetzel, following several decades as one of the greatest ever ballet dancers in the world. He is president of the Juilliard School and artistic director of the Vail Dance Festival. So I'm going to try and come at this issue from a couple of different slices and start out by talking about context, because ultimately everybody comes to this from an individual place. So Damian, going to start with you. You have been, I think, particularly vividly interested in this as you consider questions about expanding free tuition at Juilliard. Can you talk a little bit about what that has surfaced for you, starting with the question of who can pay, who can't pay? Why does that matter in the context of a conservatory that's all about individual excellence?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kate. Great to be with you both, and back with Melody, who I got so much out of our partnership during the Obama administration years. And I think a lot of what I wouldn't answer that comes out of some of that experience. But I'd go back even further. I started dancing when I was 4 years old. I was a boy in ballet, which meant essentially that I had a free education. Because it was, a scarcity issue. And as I went through my youth, and I had other kind of lessons, ballet was the one that took, and by the time I was 15, I danced for the first time in New York, and by the time I was 18, I was in New York City Ballet. But I never lost sight of the fact that this was an amazing opportunity that was presented to me without any barriers. Zero. The biggest barrier probably was peer pressure not to do it. As it turns out, my personality was such that that was an incentive. What was the word you used?
Oppositional?
Oppositional. So there was that. But fast forward to finish dancing. I was very fortunate to run an arts policy program here at the Institute for about 7 years. I know many of you from those days when we would present panels and performances about this very subject without actually naming it. We would talk about this intersection of art and society and what that actually adds up to in solving problems in terms of from an educational value. We certainly heard about that this morning and yesterday, the idea of curiosity and passion-driven learning and what actually makes you learn, what makes you remember, what makes you care, what makes you curious, and how art and culture are definitional in that as they are in defining what a society actually is, historically and presently and into the future. Fast forward yet again, to 5 years ago, I became president of Juilliard. And my first tasks were all around a legacy institution moving forward? How do you take something that started in 1905 as America's answer to European classical music, essentially? We too. And by the 1950s, it adds dance. And it's actually the incubator of American modern dance. It is where Martha Graham was. It is where Jose Limon was. And it sent Pina Bausch out into the world. It went from there. Robert Battle went to Juilliard. This is, the crucible of modern dance is very much intertwined with Juilliard. And then they add drama in 1960s at Lincoln Center. And so when I came to Lincoln Center as a dancer, I looked at that place as a culmination of something. Lincoln Center was a culmination of a belief that America could have great cultural institutions and would invest in them and would say, a version of we too. And it was an exclusionary version, as we know, and as we acknowledge increasingly that it was an exclusionary version of one vision and didn't include all who belonged in that story and all who could create and all who did create and weren't acknowledged. But in my role now, I have the opportunity to take the world's greatest conservatory for music, dance, and drama, where those graduates who are the epitome of excellence in their performance, but also in their creativity, because it is also the choreographers and composers and playwrights. It is the directors. It is the executive directors, too. These are the people who go out and populate Lincoln Center theaters and out and out and out globally and say, who belongs in this story? Who belongs with their talent to come to Juilliard and have their next step that will influence society further and further? And as I went through these last years, 5 years, I came to the conclusion, along with my incredible board chair and my board and my institution, that we needed to erase all barriers to the extent we can. And that is translated to moving the institution forward in its practices, always building on that mythology of excellence, taking it forward. I encourage you to Google John Batiste, Juilliard, New York Times, and you'll see an editorial he wrote there 2 weeks ago about building on that mythology. He's now on the board. He's an alum, taking it forward. But right there with that, moving the institution is making it steadily more affordable, with the moonshot being a tuition-free Juilliard. And so that's where, to me, this is creating the culture that influences society. This is creating the culture that binds communities. These are the teachers. These are going out into the world in a way without the debt that encumbers their creativity and their passion and their promise, but in a conversation that is expansive and pluralistic and full of curiosity, and not simply limited to a conversation about a narrower vision of what excellence is.
Thank you. So, Christopher, museums.
Yeah.
Some folks think this is the worst possible time to be a museum director.
Right.
I understand there was a conference recently where museum directors spontaneously sang "I will survive" on the bus, going from one place to another. But when you and I were talking, you said you thought it was one of the best times to be a director because institutions have never been closer to society. So talk to us a little bit about what this moment in this context is for you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and my two new colleagues I'm fascinated by already. And a terrific question. I think what I would say is that, from my perspective, accountability to a public and a willingness to be dialogic with a public is about the most important thing that we can do as leaders of cultural institutions. So the fact that we're being held differently to account by young activist staff members who say, no, 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 you can't profess values without living them, or by audiences who say, we want to see ourselves represented on your walls, or by aspiring curators and directors who say, back to the point of access, I deserve the right to move into a leadership role within an institution and to make sure that the cultural histories of which I'm a part should be represented on those walls. So I personally think the dissolution of the bubble and the fact that public discourse is now bearing down with a kind of frantic energy on museums is unbelievably energizing. And we were talking a little bit before about the fact that museums historically have been a progression of stylistic histories that appear to be immune to social forces. You know, we don't talk so much about the moment in which a thing was made. Art history does this well. Art history in textbooks does this well. We don't talk so much about the particularities of makers. and embodying those people and making it clear that they were a part of society. So I think that kind of symmetry of accountability to what people want from the outside and a willingness to actually be with them and respond to it makes for the most exciting moment in American museum history to helm an institution. I would far rather be in, of, and about people than I would exist in an ivory tower separate and apart from the concerns of society. So I understand that it makes the job much more pressureful, and maybe you weren't trained in an art history classroom to take on those questions, but I think it makes us more dimensional leaders to exist in that space. So I'm of a very different disposition, probably minority. Oppositional. Yeah.
So art as public good in terms of social cohesion, banging down the doors of museums. Damian,
Yes.
You've talked about it in terms of, the commodity. What is the cost of admission, literally? So, Melody, you're one of the great champions of government support for the arts in some of your past roles. How did you understand the value of arts and culture? How do you understand the value of arts and culture for society? And I would just beg you to recount the anecdote you told me about Senator Kennedy saying if there was a pill. I'm going to let you finish.
Sure. Well, as my colleagues have said, it's great to be with you all, and I'm excited to engage on this topic. I'll start by saying this. I actually wanted to be Damian. Flute lessons, piano lessons, ballet lessons, violin lessons, and then as an adult, Broadway theater dance, drawing this summer, watercolor, the list goes on. Ballroom. And as you might have guessed, it hasn't quite emerged into a career that looked like his. But I say all that to say the deep appreciation, my name is Melody. I mean, obviously, the arts were important in my home. And so a deep appreciation for the arts as a reflection of our humanity, the arts because of beauty, and for what they make me feel, but also a recognition of the role that the arts play as a mirror on our society, as a prompt for progress and change in our society, as an asset to improve our society. And I say all that, and I think at different points in time. Think Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit and what that meant for the anti-lynching movement in the 1930s. Think about Harry Belafonte and others during the civil rights movement. Think, and I was just last week in Montgomery, Alabama with Brian Stevenson at the Equal Justice Initiative and the museum and the memorial, and an extraordinary art collection that he has there. And all because these are ways for us to better understand who we are, artists as provocateurs of who we should be. And Damian was reflecting on work that we did together when I was in the administration, the role that policymaking and the arts have as wonderful bedfellows in making change. Kate was reflecting on the story that I mentioned when I worked for Senator Kennedy, who had a deep, deep appreciation for the arts, always had a person on his staff who was an arts staff person. And I remember one day we were working on something relevant to music, and he said, you know, Melody, if people could take a pill that would do for you what the arts does for you, people would be flocking to it. But instead, our tendency in society is to devalue that, or certainly not to place enough value on it. And so when I was in the White House, one of the things that we did, and I remember artists and the arts community being extremely surprised, because typically the arts were in the province of the East Wing, so the First Lady's office. And what we did was to join forces, and when I led the Domestic Policy Council, it was an East Wing, West Wing partnership, because we recognized the role of the arts and the importance of the arts in transforming society. So, for example, Damian and I had a wonderful experience, and one of the ways that our friendship deepened and grew as a result of the Turnaround Arts program. And so, in addition to the importance of arts education for arts education, this was a factor of bringing artists and arts into schools, particularly low-performing schools, to help students with math and reading, curiosity, attendance. You know, there are so many, when we studied this, and we did the longitudinal work, when we studied this over a period of time, we saw all of the benefits that you can imagine, including students wanting to be at school, coming and staying, students who used to not like school being there, and their performance in other areas of study improving. Also working with Rocco Landesman when he was leading the NEA, we were thinking about this critical moment of the economic crisis when the administration started, and thinking about placemaking and the role of cultural institutions, the role that artists play in community at a time of deep economic stress. So consistently, there's a history that tells us why the arts are a public good, the importance of arts in the public sector, and I had the privilege of being able to act on that in different roles in government.
Well, thank you. I'm going to come back to why that has or hasn't continued, or why sometimes that legacy is obscured. But Damian, I want to come back to you and sort of try now pushing through on this issue around the issue of marketplace. Mm-hmm. And that both means as commodity, but also the sense of place that we were talking before can be so vivid when you think about the value of arts and culture. But for you in particular, you are running a conservatory, which is devoted to exceptionalism at a time when the discourse is all about access. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you've talked about going tuition free for the folks who have the privilege of studying at Juilliard, but to what extent do you think you have an opportunity to emphasize artists as public good when you are working by definition in a cloistered is an analogy, not an actual fact, circumstance? I mean, you've been one of the people championing the notion of artist as citizen, but, you know, and the John Batiste example is somebody who's certainly gone out and made a point of, you know, sort of being very tactile. But how do you figure? Is it that we have to shape artists differently in the coming generations? Is it just that some artists will always be more aligned with the notion of public good?
Certainly some will be more, but I would say that the broader kind of ambition of connecting is what it comes down to, that the role of art and artists is actually to connect. It's something that, you know, let's just say that, you know, for myself as an artist that I love, I want it to live in you. It doesn't work just with me. It is social. It is a social animal, what we're trying to encourage here. And the two sides of a coin here, when I think about the days in classrooms for turnaround arts and the idea of working with teachers and working with communities to try to enliven the school experience so that the parents would be involved, so that attendance would be better, so that teamwork would be better, so that the art that the student encountered when walking into their building gave them pride and gave them a sense of place, of purpose, of place of learning. It's the flip side of this from now. The other side of the coin is that I'm working with the artists who are at that level that will connect that much better and can be out in the world making that much more of an impact in their artistry. And John is a great example. You know, he champions what he calls social music. It was all about it. But he recognized the reason he went to Juilliard was to play better and to play next to the people who were going to be with him for the rest of his life, and they are. His band is full of his classmates from Juilliard, and they were on the subways in 2012, and now they're, you know, playing the White House. They're playing the world, as it were, in that global sense. But it is because of their exceptional abilities. And the idea for me is that twin thing of, you know, the access from the, you know, these extraordinarily talented kids that are everywhere. They do not come from one place. So what it started with me was, okay, how do we recruit? Where do we recruit? The pandemic was an amazing thing for us in some ways. It was terrible in some ways. Other ways, open houses on Zoom brought so many people to Juilliard who would never have thought they belonged to Juilliard, that they could actually have a place in a school that was, you know, the place where Yo-Yo Ma went. And I'll finish with that idea of the citizen artist, who Yo-Yo is sort of call him the cellist in chief. You know, he did something this last winter that I'm still thinking about and I talk about a lot. He was playing at the New York Philharmonic. He was playing Elgar Cello Concerto, as he does. And he finished, and he came back. Great, encore, 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 encore. And he stopped them, and he spoke to the audience at David Geffen Hall. And he explained when the piece was written, 1919, the context, right after the First World War, the ambition that was the war to end all wars, we were going to go somewhere else, the reality, that's not what happened. And then he bridged to one of his heroes, Pablo Casals, who played the Kennedy White House famously. And Casals refused to play out of, you know, concern for injustice, a concern for refugees. But he would play this one piece, Yo-Yo said. And it was Song of the Birds. And Yo-Yo sat down and played it. And it was like being in the living room. The entire hall just leaned forward. And as we walked out, we all commented that it was the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. And, you know, to get that opportunity to connect on that level that he did was the Elgar. But then he took it somewhere else. And that's the example that our students at Juilliard are following. That's the example that they are taking in their fellowship programs, in the work that they admire. And it is, you know, it is an open invitation to take that level of artistry and take it somewhere. And that is what the public good of it is, actually. That it can enliven community, it can enliven place. I didn't even get to that, but we'll get there. But that idea that level of artistry, it just opens the door. And it is, again, it's teachers, it's makers, it's not just performance. It's so much more than that.
Well, and what you're describing is a degree of connection that doesn't have a price. Go ahead.
Just a little bit, coda on the Yo-Yo story. And talking to Yo-Yo about what he does and why he does what he does, and he talks about the fact that he recognizes that this is all so much bigger than he is, and that this is in service to something that is larger than he is. So it is a public-mindedness that comes with the artistry, and hence the citizen artist title that
Absolutely.
You have and that Yo-Yo has and others.
Well, he's always there, too. You know what I mean? At the events that matter, those moments of mourning, those moments of celebration. And I remember, you know, my wife Heather Watts asked him, you know, how do you make this? And he says, these are my duties. These are my ecumenical duties. That this is what being an artist is. This is what I can do. And it is a beautiful vision. And it is one that, you know, not everybody is called for. I've had students of mine say, well, what if I just play? Is that okay? And the answer is, of course, because you are having an impact in that as well. But it is that open invitation to actually, you know, participate and define your time through art, which it does. It is what we remember.
So moving over to you, Christopher, you work in a world where there is an arc from artists who just make and may never be rewarded or recognized to a stupendous commercial market where, you know, there are breathless reports on the latest auction sale prices. Where do you see museums in that context? And is part of the problem about understanding art as a public good is that there isn't enough recognition that it works in all those registers? Is part of it that museums have been slow to steward what you were describing as this closeness to society? Talk to us a little about commercial nonprofit.
I mean, I think, so the art market, the largest unregulated market in the world, manipulated by a very small group of people to establish value, which then tends to move back to them. I would say that doing that is almost impossible without the advocacy of institutions. So I don't think you achieve market ascendance in the context of an ex-artist work unless you have museum exposure, museum representation. It does not work. So that, of course, bridges and relates very directly to questions of diversity and equity in art history, which is my ongoing fixation. So if you look at auction results historically, you'll find, and this should come as no surprise, those artists that bring the highest values are almost exclusively white men. If you look at the vast majority of institutional collections, they're 96 to 98% white male. So the value lies in very specific places. So what I would say, one massive contribution we can make as future-directed progressive institutions grounded in DEI values is to say, no, actually these artists are the ones that we're going to champion, both looking back and looking forward. Invariably, the market then begins to follow that, and there is a correction around the value of artists formerly ignored as a part of art history, which are then integrated into more dominant narratives. This is an interest of mine. I would also say that a lot of private people participate really radically in that. So I was invoking in our previous conversation a collector named Pamela Joyner, who is on the board of SF MoMA. She's also chair of painting and sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So two of the most prestigious, important, influential seats in any institution anywhere in the world. Maybe 15 years ago or so, she started to collect abstraction by Black Americans. At that point, there was absolutely no interest in that work whatsoever. There was no market, there was no awareness. Collectors weren't going after it, institutions weren't going after it. So it was sort of a field of wild possibility. In that period of time, she established probably the greatest collection of Black abstraction in anyone's hands, museums included. And in the course of doing that, has significantly influenced the collecting patterns of museums across the world, to the point where those paintings that she was formerly able to buy for, let's say, to make this real, $125,000, are now either too scarce to buy or worth tens of millions. So there is a way in which not-for-profits can collaborate with collectors and instrumentalize the art market, in my view, to bring about really just change that has a very basic relationship to society. And I think if you do that work effectively, you begin to change your audience. And if you change your audience, you change access to the art world and give those people formerly excluded agency to begin to shape that world. So to me, that's a really profound public good that happens through representation and pulling many, many levers simultaneously to change the way that we organize. So I'm not shy about the art market. I think it's another tool that we can use towards a bigger public good.
Well, being a market maker gives you a position of strength and not just a passive...
And a moral responsibility.
Well, doing it ethically is a different, in some ways, understanding of the role. So, Melody, you have talked about how you are specifically located in Richmond these days. Mm-hmm. And that's a city that has gone through a particularly vivid form of racial reckoning with the statue of Lee. But you've also described how the city is trying to figure out if it can be the next Silicon Valley and looking past so many of the cultural assets that are local to it. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the market and perhaps a sense of place and some of the ways that culture either just doesn't resonate or is resonating so vibrantly but just isn't recognized, in terms of the monuments issue, for example?
Sure, and weaving that together. So Richmond, Virginia is a mid-sized city. I don't know, have any people in the room been to Richmond? Okay.
Oh, wow. Hey. Team Richmond in the house.
Go Richmond. So the metro area is about 1.2 million, and it is the home of Virginia Commonwealth University, which has one of the best art schools in the country, a top 5 art school. And there are the reverberations that come as a result of that. A real maker community, a community of artisans, and lots of different kinds of related industries and businesses that are there. It is also home to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which is one of the top 10 collecting museums. It is, and with an extensive African-American collection now, led by Valerie Cassell Oliver as a curator there. And it has a real culture scene, museums and students and a population that seems to reflect that. And at the same time, and even with studies that have been done, not just of Richmond, but of other places, that show this kind of vibrancy can help you create a real sense of place. And for a place to be different and recognized and attractive to people as such. But it's, at the same time, there are still conversations that I hear consistently from those who are in various leadership positions, like, well, maybe we can be the new Austin, or maybe we can be the new Research Triangle Park, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. I went to school in Chapel Hill. I have appreciation for Research Triangle Park. And we should build those industries as well. But my argument, and the argument of others there, is that we should really focus on what makes Richmond, Richmond. Let Richmond be Richmond. And there is a vibrancy that comes from this arts and culture community, and there's an economic benefit that comes from it, and there's an education benefit and already a footprint there that would allow for a real growth of these industries and a vibrancy in the city, and a pathway for young people through the public school systems and others and elsewhere that would allow this to grow and to catch hold in the city. At the same time, I think there is a real struggle, to go directly to your question, Kate, for people, particularly in leadership, to put chips down on the idea that the arts, and thinking about the arts very broadly, would allow for a real economy or foothold in the economy of the city. And it's a city that has a significantly poor part of the community to thrive. And I think in some ways is because the arts are often seen as something that's nice to have, something that other people have, something that people have and attend to when they are privileged to be able to do so, but not something that can sit at the heart of a city and that can play a significant role in the economy of place and to shape it and to build off of it. The particular irony, and you alluded to this, given the role of the statues in Richmond, for those who have been to Richmond and those who probably haven't, you are familiar with Monument Avenue in Richmond. So public art has been a part of the city for quite some time. Monuments put up in the late 1890s through the 1920s, reflecting the lost cause narrative in the city. And in fact, my husband and I live on Monument Avenue. Could throw a stone where the Lee statue used to sit and the Jeb Stuart statue used to sit from where we live. And watching what happened over the summer of 2020 that ultimately led to the statues coming down was, I think, a real reflection on these two big moments in time. This moment where that public art was important not only to the city and the narrative of the city and a message that was being sent by putting those statues up, and the role that the arts and artists and community members played in bringing those statues down. And in fact, you may remember that the New York Times called the Lee statue plinth the most important piece of public art in the year of 2020, once it was covered in graffiti and sent a message about what the community wanted and needed and wanted reflected in its public space. So the arts are a vibrant part of the city. Cultural institutions are a vibrant part, but I think, as in so many other places, there is still a reckoning with the role that the arts can play in helping the city move forward, not only culturally, but also economically, and thinking about its role in education, not only with a post-secondary institution, but all the way down and through K-12 systems.
So before we open it up to questions, I just want to ask the three of you for some strategic insight, because I think, predictably, Melody's done an extraordinary job of summarizing. The facts are there, the perception isn't. As you said to me, people keep looking past the arts to something else, not clear why. So here is a comment made a couple of years ago in support of ending liberal arts majors. Many of these people would be better off becoming plumbers, including financially. Who are you going to call when your pipes freeze in the middle of the night? An MA in Italian art? So I think in many quarters, that's kind of what this conversation is up against in terms of appreciating art as a public good. So just going to ask each of you if you have a point of view about what's the clapback.
Okay.
Christopher?
Once again, let's just say, once again, that is, it's not a binary. It's, first of all, where do you want to live? What kind of a lifestyle would you like to have? What do you want your kids to experience when they walk outside the door? What is the sense of aspiration that you would like to have? How would you like to attract people to your neighborhood who want to live there and to be a part of that? Plumbers included. That these things are not mutually exclusive. So that's my first reaction is that's just an asinine.
Challenging.
Challenging.
Let's call it a false binary.
It's a false binary. That's fine. But beyond that, let me just say that the tactical of it requires leadership. And that's part of this. That's part of why we come to an Ideas Festival, to get ideas and take them back to our communities, to take them back to our jobs, take them back to our families, and take them forward. And so my hope here is that everyone here and anybody you talk to about, you take it back and you say, you know what, actually, art is a public good. We need to actually encourage our leaders. And not just private leadership, public leadership. People like Melody who took that value of the art and said, you know what, we're going to turn around schools with art. And I was in those schools. I was in schools that, Orchard Gardens in Massachusetts took away the metal detectors and put art everywhere. Art that the students respected and loved and were proud of and couldn't wait to come to school and to show their parents what they were doing. That was a strategy that was used. So when I think about strategies, I think that's a strategy, to believe in it and to exercise that sense of belief and put it to use in different ways. That's what I encourage our students to think about. I encourage our partner organizations to say, we can help with this. What is that quote you said to me? We talked about it right before. For every problem, art at the least is the second best solution, is culture. To get people to go there, to learn, to take actions, to be inspired, to get yourselves up in the morning, to go forward. So I'd say that.
Melody, Chris?
I have a very sharp and specific response to that, which is relating back to my time in Baltimore, but an ethic and an idea that I brought forward with me to San Francisco as well. So what I would say is that, in fact, and this reverts to your comment about the citizen artist, what defines some of the most important artists living and working today is that they're world makers. They aren't just illustrators anymore. So Yo-Yo Ma is probably an embodiment of this. In my world, I would say there's Kehinde Wiley, there's Mark Bradford, there's Theaster Gates, there's Rick Lowe, there's Micheline Thomas. And those people aren't proposing ideas on an inert surface anymore. They're doing that as well, and we can acquire them and represent them within our collections. They're also demanding and building institutions that are instruments of world change. They're actually doing that. So that idea of, let's say, just use abstraction as a sort of straw man in this, and you go all the way back to the early 1900s and Malevich in Russia and the invention of abstraction. That was a pure condition of proposition. It was just illustration. It was something that existed. It did its work in that space. And those artists are not interested in that anymore. What they're doing is making proposals and then finding ways and means in the world to actualize those proposals as a lived experience for the audience, as institutions that meet need, as institutions that meet people where they are. So what I would say is that art has moved from a condition of very sort of self-satisfied absence of utility to a condition of that and true utility, world change. So to that, I would say that's just as important as the work of a plumber, a gardener, a trash collector, or whatever. We're all contributors to exactly the same ecology. And art is moving towards the pragmatic in the way that I think is really useful for the purposes of institutions that want to see themselves as relevant, embedded in society, and meaningful. So my great guides are those artists. And I always say that we're living through, and we should be alive to it, a golden generation of Black American artists who are not only the best, they're changing what art is. That is really profound to me. And it has to do with need and change and utility in a way that we've never seen before.
So after the plumber fix your pipes, you want Mark Bradford to make you
he might have designed a pipe that didn't break, is what I mean.
That too. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Melody?
Yeah, I mean, what they said, I don't understand why this is a zero-sum game. Yeah. We can have one or we can have the other. And when I think about, I work at the University of Virginia, and I think about the idea of education at the University of Virginia. And at the beginning, obviously fraught. It was for a very small sliver of citizens. But as that grew and as that has expanded, the host idea that education and citizenship requires us to have a whole host of skills and experiences and education, the arts included. That this is a reflection of, it is part of what makes us human. It shapes and serves as a filter on the way that we see the world, the way that we engage others, the way that we are world changers, the ways that we define ourselves and engage with other people. And unless we actively, desperately hold on to, cling to, and energize and invigorate that aspect of our humanity, we are lost. Think about the things that concern us most, the things that are most troubling to us, that are most disturbing to us at this moment. And they come back to a core, a root of that sense of humanity and engagement and the ability to think and to discuss and to build a world with other people. Mm-hmm. And I think the arts allow us to do that in very significant, tangible ways. This isn't, as I said before, for other people, something privileged, something other, something nice, something fancy, something you get to when you've got everything else. And I would also say, on a very tangible level, that as people are engaging in the sciences, they are often talking to and engaging with, and many of them are coming from, the arts and the humanities. These are not estranged entities. These are aspects of ourselves that have to come together for us to create the world and to be the people that we aspire and say we want to be.
Beautiful.
So on that note, happy to take some questions.
It's beautiful.
We have one here and then here.
Thank you so much. This was
There's a microphone.
such a meaningful and important conversation. Thank you, Kate, for your moderation. And Melody, this may be for you, and my son went to VCU Arts, and he's now getting an MFA, and it is an incredible program. You know, Rhode Island has really formed one of the most amazing interdisciplinary approaches to highlighting the arts through all sorts of different sectors. Do you see other cities following suit, and why are they the only ones right now?
I do, and in different ways. I think even at VCU, with the proposed building, and in fact, my husband and I saw like the groundbreakers being rolled out to construct the new arts and technology building and a place for interdisciplinary work. And I certainly have seen that. I sit on the advisory board for the Institute of Contemporary Art at VCU, so hearing from the administration their views about how this work can cut across as a horizontal across a lot of verticals. But I also think about it, you know, at UVA and the way that our general education program is being redefined and reformed, including the aesthetics. So I see this as a place of growth in lots of different institutions, but there is a real jostling, a real back and forth, and a real battle, and oftentimes this pendulum kind of swings wildly from one direction to the other. But I think and hope that more institutions are starting to understand the value of the integrated education. And one of the things, and you know, don't we all want to go back to college? I know I do. And because, you know, I see students now and they're shaping their majors, and they're bringing together lots of different elements. And I think schools, colleges, universities are trying to respond to that.
I have two quick things on that. Just the level of ambition is in question. It's like, let's have big ambition. That's what I hear. I'm like, let's try for more. You said the word bubble, and I immediately, just saying it, I go, right, anti-bubble, anti-bubble, open wide. One of the first things we did at Juilliard when I got there is we started a Julie Art project, where there was art around the students so that they could actually be getting food. It wasn't enough to just have, you know, collaborate with the dancer if you're a musician, or, no, let's have the visual art in that mix as well, but keep going and keep going. Because I think what we're talking about here actually is an ambition for a great civilization. Don't we want that? Or, I mean, should we not try everything we can to have that? And where is culture in that? And I think it's inescapably at the center. It's like, right, the glue.
Hi, thank you so much for this. This is a great talk. I'm a member of the Writers Guild of America. I'm currently on strike against the Hollywood studios. And as a young emerging writer, it's been both a vital education and also a very rude awakening that as much as I got into this line of work for trying to connect with people and trying to be a public good, it is ultimately labor, and that labor is often devalued. And so I'm curious how you would talk to, or an artist, someone trying to do this professionally, like myself or anybody else, about how to think about art as a public good when you might be doing it within a private sector, and when the way that you're getting value out of it is so predominantly through the concept of labor.
That's really interesting. I can take a quick stab very quickly, just from the perspective of museums, because we've been so much in the news over the past 2 or 3 years around questions of unionization and proper compensation for arts workers. So SF MoMA has the largest and oldest union of any American institution, so incredibly powerful. What's interesting about it, and I've talked about this a lot, what's interesting about working with unions is that if you have an equity-based agenda anyway, they can help push you along in the correct direction and help you treat the bulk of your employees, union and non-union, in an equitable, progressive fashion. So I would say that the rise of awareness of collective power in the arts is another one of those very new things in the museum field in particular. So I don't know so much about the predicament you're in at the moment, but certainly activities within SF MoMA and other institutions could come to a grinding halt were we not willing to come to the table, negotiate in good faith, and reach an equitable outcome with our employees. And I really do, the most fundamental point to me is this. If we profess as museums to live by progressive values, and if we do want to build the great society, you actually have to model that culture within your walls. It is not okay just to buy the great Kerry James Marshall painting and imagine that your work is done. What he's telling you to do is build that equitable world within your museum. So, I'm a big advocate for that. I don't see unions as adversaries. I see them as partners in modeling a new and better world within the museum setting itself as a way to suggest that possibility beyond the museum's walls.
One more question? You got somebody in the back, and I'm always sympathetic to people in the back. Oppositional.
What might be your feelings or your thinking about art as aesthetics and the consequence of aesthetics involving itself in activism?
That seems like that one's for me. Yeah, so I think one term that's come up in this conversation is sort of false binaries. And I'm of the opinion, and would sort of defend this in any forum, that the artists I champion who are activists, who are world modelers, are also the greatest and most excellent artists working today. So there for me isn't a division between my claim that, say, Mark Bradford is the greatest living abstract painter, which I take him to be, and also an activist for change within his community through his founding of a not-for-profit that is designed to advocate for transitional age youth moving out of a foster care system and into the world as young adults. So I think that it's a really complicated idea of being fully dimensional as an artist, as opposed to just a passive maker. That idea, I think, is steadily disappearing from the collective consciousness within the museum field. And it's always been our obligation to follow artists where they want to take us. Art history is written by the artist, not by me. I think my capacity maybe is to identify what's new and different. So if art history is a series of doors opening and doors closing, and the artist's obligation is to rupture that history, do something unique and different, it's my obligation to identify that and integrate them into a history. So at this point, there is no division between the activist and the aesthete. They are the same, and I find that to be completely electrifying. And I don't ever diminish my investment in quality for the sake of advocating for their activist causes. It has to be held in equal balance, and I think it's pretty preponderant in the art world today. It's an excellent question.
Lightning round. Damian, same question. Is Beethoven okay, even as you expand the canon?
Beethoven is thriving. even as we expand the canon. Some of you were in a session earlier where I showed a film of tradition and innovation side by side. Schumann to John Williams to Nick Britell, who composed Succession, to Baroque music on the one hand, with those same Baroque musicians playing the Pulitzer Prize-winning composer from this year, Rhiannon Giddens. These things are amplified. They take the tradition as the foundation to go forward. So yes and yes and yes. Yes.
So, Melody, for the first time in the pandemic, the federal government actually allocated relief that included nonprofit arts and culture, not just golf courses and aquaria as in the past. Is that a sign that people are getting a little more comfortable with this tension between activism and aesthetics? Is it a sign that the field is getting better at advocating for the arts as a public good? Either, neither?
I think certainly the advocacy for arts as a public good, and in that moment, recognizing jobs, community, vibrancy, all the things we were desperate to try and hold on to. Sadly, I hate to go out on a pessimistic note. I don't know that I would be cautious about saying that it is a big pivot moment, because I think that was such a highly unusual moment. But what I do hope is, as people recognize the importance of the arts and desperately craved it and were trying to hold on to it in that moment, that it would open people to that argument and to that kind of advocacy when things are kind of, quote, normal. But I don't know if that was our big we've taken the hill moment.
Well, with that, I just want to thank our extraordinary panelists.
Thank you, Kate.